Hi, I'm Al with Summit Racing. This is a new project vehicle we're going to be working on today. This is Crusty. Crusty is a 1966 Corvette coupe. It's got a big block hood on it. It is not an original big block car, so we don't want to freak out any of the purists that think that we're going to be cutting up and modifying and doing things to a very rare big block mid-year Corvette. What we are going to do is take Crusty from the barn find that it was when I got it to a nice, reliable, running, driving, fun hot rod. Some of the things we're going to cover with this are going to be pretty much the basics of what we had to do to get it running. The other thing we are going to do is go through the suspension completely. So as you see when we begin tearing this car apart, every bushing on this car literally disintegrates when you take it apart. Everything is worn out. I got the car running, driving, drove it around the block once. Once I did that, that was enough. Every bushing's got to be replaced. So if you've got a Camaro, Firebird, Chevelle, the front suspension is going to be pretty close. Might be front steer versus rear steer, but the idea is generally the same. The rear of this car is going to be quite a bit different. Rear suspension on this car is independent. Corvette was the only GM vehicle that had that. It's got a transverse leaf spring, and it has two trailing arms that go up into pockets in the frame. Those trailing arms are held in with a bolt that goes horizontally through the frame. You always have to cut that bolt out because no matter what you do, that bolt welds itself into place. So we're going to show you how to do that, take the whole rear suspension apart. We're going to cover all the things that we do to Crusty and a bunch of online content. Hit the subscribe button, subscribe to the Summit Racing YouTube channel, follow this and all the other good content that we have to offer. So one of the first things that we're going to do before we even try to loosen a single nut is you want to take every cotter pin out of the suspension assembly. Also, before we started work today, I soaked every bolt with penetrating oil just to try to make things a little bit easier when we go to break it apart. If you miss these little cotter pins, this little guy right here, you can see I got to bend the ears back on it so I can pull it straight through the tie rod. If you fail to do this and you begin to loosen that nut, you will back over that little cotter pin and your life will not be very good because what will happen is it'll wedge and break off the cotter pin. You'll bind up the nut on the tie rod and then you will be getting out a cutting torch and that is no fun. So we've got to take all these little cotter pins out, tie rods, upper, lower, ball joints. Once we get that done, I'm going to pull the shock out of the middle of the coil spring, and then I'm also going to pull the front sway bar off. And then after that, we'll break the ball joints loose, break the tie rod loose, and we'll be good to go. So now we're just going to take out the top shock retaining nut. This actually has a little capture nut on top of it, which I guess is an old school way of holding the shock nut in place. So we're going to zip the little tiny thin top one off first. That's already out and captured in our socket. And now we're going to zip the nut out. Parts of Crusty. Now we're going to zip out the lower shock bolts. So this is a very good reason why we need to go through everything in the suspension on this car. It's been sitting for so long. The shock bushing literally just falls apart in your hand as you're pulling it out. So I don't know about you, but I do not want to drive the car with all these bushings falling apart and everything being so loose. Another little tip, when you're pulling these shocks out, this came apart real easily. Normally those nuts on something that's rusty do not come off that simple. What you can do, take a 9/16 long socket, take the longest extension you have, and you can just work the thing back and forth and you literally can snap the threads off the shock and then everything will just come out the bottom. It just makes your life a little bit easier rather than fighting, trying to hold the shaft, break the nut loose, all that kind of stuff. You literally can go back and forth about 20 times and you'll snap through the threads on the shaft and then you can drop the shock right out. So this has another one of those little capture nuts on it. Thankfully, this thing actually, since I soaked it with penetrating oil, literally just threads right off. And again, you can see these are pretty bad. See the bottom bushings all cracked apart. So barn finds always sound like fun, and they are, because this will be a really fun project, but just know what you're getting into. When a car sits for a long time, this is why this car is nicknamed Crusty. This is old crusty stuff. but we're gonna make it all better, and Summit Racing has all the parts you need to make this much better. All right, so now we are gonna get the tie rod loosened up, and we're gonna use a pickle fork and a big hammer to get that out of the way. Take our trusty pickle fork that I think I've had this tool for probably like 25 years. There we go, tie rod's out of the way. Now we're gonna go ahead and loosen the upper ball joint nut, and we're just gonna get it loose. We're not gonna take it, oh look, it's coming right apart. So what you don't wanna do, because we still have tension on the coil spring, you don't wanna take this all the way off or everything is gonna separate. So we've got that loosened up. We're gonna loosen up the lower. So just to make sure we're not gonna have any kind of an accident, we put a floor jack underneath the lower control arm. So when we loosen the lower ball joint, if this happens to be loose as well. So we are gonna loosen the lower ball joint nut. So we got that a little loose. We'll go a little bit more. We are going to take our pickle fork. We are gonna separate the ball joint from the spindle. You always wanna leave this nut on the lower ball joint, because as you're separating this with the pickle fork, you just want everything to come apart. But you want to be able to do that with a little bit of tension from the spring on it. It just makes it easier. The other thing you can do if you're nervous about having the tension from the coil spring on it is compress the coil spring first, and that'll relax everything. So you can do it either way. You should always have a floor jack underneath the lower control arm though. That is definitely the right way to do this, just to avoid any type of an accident or anything coming loose. All right, so now that we've got our coil spring out of the way, our spindle assembly is broken loose from the upper and lower ball joints. We're gonna set this off to the side, check the brake rotors, we'll take the bearings apart, clean, re-grease everything. If it needs new rotors, obviously, I happen to know a place, Summit Racing, where I'm gonna buy some rotors from. We're also gonna rebuild and replenish and restore all these parts, get them painted, get everything looking nice and clean. The next step of what we have to do is remove the upper and lower A-arm from the frame. Once we get those off the car, they're gonna go over to our powder coater. We are gonna have him coat the upper and lower arms. We'll press the new bushings in, and then it'll be time for reassembly. One other little tip that might help you when you go to reassemble the car, and this will hold true on the Corvette, on the front upper control arms as well as the rear trailing arms. When you take the shims out, label them driver side front, driver side rear, passenger front, passenger rear, etc. Reason being, when you go to reassemble the vehicle, even though you're going to have all new components on it, it at least gives you a starting point for the alignment. You'll have to obviously set toe and all those kind of things with the spinning the tie rods in and out, but this will at least give you a good starting point. In the rear with the trailing arms, there will be shims on the inside and outside, same thing. Mark driver side inner, driver side outer, passenger inner, passenger outer. It just will make your life a lot easier and a little bit simpler when you go to put the car back together. So moving on to the rear suspension, now that we have the front suspension apart, the first thing we're going to do is going to be to separate the transverse rear leaf spring from the rear control arm. Similar to the front suspension, this little cotter pin is one of the first things that has to come out. We're going to take that out, loosen the nut up, drop the spring down, and then we'll take off the emergency brake, the shock, and the drive shaft, or half shaft I should call it, and then we're going to cut the trailing arm bolt out. So we'll get started. So that is a very clearly non-stock part. I think between the air shocks that were on this car and how flattened out the rear spring was, they were trying to come up with some kind of a spacer to shove the spring up to get the ride height where they wanted. So that's interesting, to say it politely. And what else do we have? A whole stack of washers that aren't going to come off the bolt now. There we go. It's all crusty together. A hockey puck. What is that? Some kind of hockey puck spacer. Interesting. And then here you can see the once new bushing. That's really not very good. So we're gonna get rid of that. And that should be about it. Now we are gonna lower the jack to let the spring down and get that separated from the trailing arm. And that is pretty worn out. Okay, now we've got to remove the emergency brake cable from the parking brake assembly. So we're going to pull this clip out first. We've taken the tension off from underneath the car of the emergency brake cables. But we're going to pull this clip out. It'll make it a little bit easier to kind of move things around. And then we're going to come to the back side where the little arm mechanism is and separate it back there as well. Okay, there's that. So now we are going to remove the shock from the car. Breaker bar. There we go. There we go. All right, so now we are going to get the toe link out of the way. This is held in place by another cotter pin, so that one thankfully slid out pretty easily, and we'll get the right size socket. Okay, so the trailing link comes out. Drive shaft is loose, and now we can cut the control arm out. Now here's where the real fun begins. All right, finally. So we finally got the trailing arms out of our 66 Corvette. It was a bit of an endeavor. I know people that do this full time are probably saying, well, what's the big deal? It's really not that hard. Technically it's not, but when you're on the garage floor, and basically like a lot of our customers are gonna be doing, using the tools that you have, like a Sawzall, wrenches, sockets, etc., you do the best with what you can. We finally did slay the dragon, so to speak. We got the trailing arms out. Next step is gonna be powder coat, push all new bushings in, new bearings, freshen up the brakes, all that good stuff. Thank you again for joining us, and make sure to hit the subscribe button.